right. Well, I want to thank you for bearing with me a bit. It's been a while since I had done a YouTube live stream, and so grateful that I got this figured out and that I'm able to join you today. Thank you so much for joining me for this webinar. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Tim Fortescue, a life coach coming alongside of folks on their life and spiritual journeys. And I'm also a trained internal family systems practitioner. And that's the primary modality that I use in my coaching practice. If you'd like to chime in with questions during this webinar, feel free to type that in the chat, and I would be glad to engage with you and your questions there. Additionally, you can check out my blog at blog.faithfullygrowing.com, and you can find some of my other information and meditations like the one that I'll lead you in a little later in the webinar here. And again, if you have questions, just let me know in the chat, and I'd be glad to engage at the end of our time there. Additionally, if you would like to let me know where you're joining from, I'm in the Madison, Wisconsin area here in the United States, but would love to hear where you're joining from if you would like to drop that in the chat. And if you're watching a recording of this, know that you can access my blog at any time, as well as engage in the chat, and I'll try to track that and follow up with your questions. Or you can always send me an email to tim@faithfullygrowing.com. But I don't know about you, but sometimes it's hard to accept many of the parts of me that I want to push away a lot of times. And instead, I'm finding that if I can accept those younger parts that may carry some shame or some vulnerability, that they have a lot to teach me, and they're doing the best that they can. Even those younger parts that may be a little ashamed, and so I hope that we can all just take a little more time over the next few minutes to be curious and embrace the power of the gifts that our authenticity and vulnerability can bring to the table and to our systems, because we do have many gifts to offer the world, even if there may be parts of us that chime in that may think otherwise. And I'm finding when we can accept them we can know that we have this inner team and we don't have to go it alone. I love Brene Brown, and she is a well-known researcher on vulnerability and shame and leading into authenticity. Here are a couple of quotes for her that I'd like to start out with. First of all, how much we know ourselves is extremely important. How much we know ourselves is extremely important, but how we treat ourselves is the most important. And I know in my growing up, I learned a lot to love others and love God or something bigger than myself. But when I talked about loving myself, I didn't hear a lot about that. And I hope we can embrace the need to love and care about ourselves and take this time to do that today. Another quote that I like is, if you trade your authenticity for safety, you may experience the following: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, addiction, rage, blame, resentment, and inexplicable grief. I think we have got to accept who we are. And even those younger parts of us that may carry trauma, be stuck in the past, carrying burdens that those younger parts shouldn't be carrying. When they know that they're not alone, they can give us a little space. They can get to know who we are. And as they get to know our inner team, that's where the healing and the growth begins, in my experience. And Ken, thanks for joining from Southwest Michigan. So let's look at 6 things that can help us embrace our authenticity and vulnerability. And here is my plan for our time together. We'll probably take less than an hour, but I'm going to give you just a little bit of content that has been helpful for me. And then I'm going to lead you in a meditation to help you connect with your internal world. And then we'll spend some time taking some of your questions if you have them. And feel free to chime in as I'm talking, and I'll try to keep a glance of the chat here. But let's look at 6 things that can help us to embrace our authenticity and vulnerability. Number 1, it's good to point out that it's the nature of the mind to have an indeterminate number of sub-personalities. We're multiple, and that's normal to have many different voices chiming in inside our head, much like the movie Inside Out that Pixar put out around 2015, where it's showing the story of the young lady and her move and how it impacted her internal system and her family moving cross country. But it gives you an insight to the anger, to the fear, to the sadness, and just knowing that we're all multiple. I'm sure you've heard someone say, a part of me really likes this, and a part of me really doesn't. And it's the nature of the mind to contain an indefinite number of parts or sub-personalities. And it's natural, it's universal, and it's useful. And trauma doesn't cause the phenomenon of multiplicity, though burdens from traumatic experiences make parts more extreme and conflicted internally. For me, a lot of the younger parts that contain my authenticity and vulnerability are the ones that I want to push away. Or, wow, those parts that say, oh, you made a fool of yourself, instead of just saying, you're doing the best that you can to keep me safe. And I want you to know that I'm not the person that you may think that I am. I'm not a 7-year-old anymore. But it makes sense that you think this way, and just welcome them in and see what they can teach us. And as a sub-personality, each part has its own characteristics, full points of view, as well as emotions, beliefs, and behaviors. An example of this is a resentful part may also feel hurt or sad, have many different opinions, and reveal itself through the body in certain ways. And often these sub-personalities, they're saying things like, I'm not good enough, or I'm not lovable. And this really heightens insecurities and hinders us from living into the reality that we're deeply loved and valued human beings. And parts of us that we see as flawed are doing the best that they can. And they bring us gifts, but they're younger, they're not alone, they're just a part. And so we're made up of many different sub-personalities. Number 2, everyone has a self. And what do I mean by self? And first of all, I mean this with a capital S. And I know that some people can be triggered by that. And if you are, just hang in there for a bit and see if I can bring some clarity. But self describes the essence of you, how you came into the world, and who you are when you're feeling things like calm, curious, compassionate, confident, courageous, clear, creative, and connected. And some other descriptors of self are when you're playful. Those young parts of us that just want to play and not be burdened with the worries that they shouldn't be carrying, when we can let them go play and let them know that we've got this. That's where that self comes in, and who we are at the core, and we can be more playful too. Patience, presence, perspective, and persistence. And there are other things that don't necessarily begin with a C or a P too, but when we're along those lines of that, curiosity specifically is one I like to tap into. We can tap into that self. And if the capital self is triggering for you, first I invite you to notice the parts that are triggered and just kind of be aware that there are parts that come up around that, and to pause and notice that first. And then from a Christian perspective and worldview, I like to think of self as my beloved self. And as I mentioned before, it's being, that me and God or spirit at the center is that core. And so rephrase that, whatever works best for you, but we all have a self. Number 3, our parts are forced into roles that they don't like due to trauma and past injuries. And so it's good for us to remember that as we embrace our authenticity. Those parts that are embarrassed and struggle with being authentic and vulnerable, and the impact of unsafe and negative experiences burdens parts with extreme emotions, memories, and sensations that get locked away, causing other parts to protect against re-experiencing of these burdens. So often this 7-year-old inner critic of mine is trying to protect me from the shame that I felt as a little boy. So it's saying, don't take that risk. Don't do that. You're not good enough. You're not capable. And it's doing the best that it can, but it doesn't know that I'm 43 now. And I've taken a lot of risks. And this young part's been with me, but it doesn't know that. It doesn't know who I am. So when I let it know that it's just a part, and that it can learn more that it's been forced into this role of protecting and carrying this burden of protecting this little boy that can be flooded with shame, is that these parts are still with me. They bring me gifts of wisdom, being wise, and being aware that you've got boundaries and you can't let people hurt you. But they don't have to carry it alone. And they've got me at the core and myself with that. Many parts may carry inherited burdens by the family, or some that have been observed through the culture and society. I know I grew up in Southern Appalachia in South Carolina, and I know so many of those roots and parts, sometimes they shame me for betraying my ancestors. Who are you to get educated and to go to college? And these little parts are protecting me of the shame that maybe others in my family system would have given me, and doing the best that they can to protect me. But me being the first to break some of the Appalachian cycles that are so familiar, even though my parts may think that I'm betraying, my intention is to learn and grow and to heal them, and to heal that culture and bring back hope to that culture rather than to abandon and betray them. And when I think in this framework, those parts that are trying to protect me will soften back. They have a deep distrust of me, and it makes sense. But as I get to know them, they trust me more. They bring the gifts, and they can unburden those burdens that they don't have to carry alone. And then number 4, the non-extreme intention of each part is something positive for you and for me. There are no bad parts. And the goal is getting to know yourself or beloved self at your core, and to get to know those parts better. It isn't to eliminate parts, but instead to help them find their non-extreme role and to be unburdened. Parts hold information and other gifts worthy of discovery and reclamation. And at their core, parts also hold qualities of self: calmness, curiosity, compassion, confidence, courage, clarity, creativity, sense of connectedness. Or if you want to go with the P words or something beyond that, playfulness, patience, presence, perspective, and persistence. And again, depending on your spiritual upbringing, qualities like calm, curious, compassionate, confident, and those qualities of self, the idea of people being basically good can be triggering, I suspect. And so I like to reframe that a little bit for those who may be triggered, and particularly for those from a Judeo-Christian background, it might be helpful to remember that humans are declared first and foremost to be created in the image of God. Yes, this image has been covered by sin and flaws and mistakes. However, if we can translate original sin as burdens, we're talking the same language. On a human level, we're all burdened, and we don't have to carry that alone. And at our core, at our best, that's what we were ideally made for and why we're living. See here, number 5, and then I'll give you one more. And then I see, Ken, your question there. I'll get to you at the end of our time here for sure in just a bit. As we develop our parts from a complex system of interactions internally, much like a family or family group of people who are polarized, form alliances and hierarchies. And similar to external relationships, when applying family systems techniques, the inner system can be reorganized. And when that happens, parts can change rapidly, and the transformation process can begin. And I've experienced this personally, and I've experienced this with clients. And then number 6, of just how to, that different mindset to reclaim our authenticity and our vulnerability. Changes in the internal will affect changes in the external system, and vice versa. The implication of this assumption is that the dynamics of both the internal and the external systems should be assessed. And changes in our internal system don't happen in isolation. It happens in community with others. And they're part of a context, such as external relationships with family members, significant others, coworkers, and so on. And Ken says, for me, it's self, as you said, my core, me here now, versus self, all capitals, for me, which is God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Just my way of looking at that. And that makes sense for sure. And I appreciate you sharing that, Ken. That's, great insight there. And if you have other questions, feel free to chime in. And thanks to whoever gave me the thumbs up there. All right, before I lead us in our meditation, let me give you 4 intentions for looking internally and embracing the power of authenticity and vulnerability. Number 1 is to liberate parts from their extreme roles. Through the process of unburdening, parts become less constrained and shift into preferred, less rigid roles in the system. Our parts bring us gifts, and these gifts can shine as parts are unburdened and less constrained. Number 2, to restore trust in self and self-leadership. As a natural leader, self-energy respects input from the parts who in turn respect that self for being open to their input. And it helps those little parts of me to trust self more, to effectively lead and heal the system internally and externally. Then the intention number 3, to achieve balance, harmony, and wholeness. Internally, to differentiate the inner system of parts, but also externally, to help parts express and engage more harmoniously in our relationships with the outer world. And then the final assumption for looking internally, embracing that power of authenticity and vulnerability is to bring more our beloved self-energy to external systems. As an individual heals, their self-energy can be healing for themselves, but also for others in the world. And maybe you have parts that say you're unlovable. I know when I type belovedness on my computer, I was curious to find out that spell check wants me to correct it to beloved mess. And maybe this isn't a coincidence. Maybe life is a beloved mess, but in this beloved mess, we too need to know that we're very valued human beings, our whole system and all of our parts at the core. And who we really are, including our parts that may carry some shame. They bring us gift. They're doing the best that they can. They're young. They shouldn't be carrying this along. They shouldn't have the capacity. They don't, but they don't have to have that capacity. They can do what they're good at, is that inner team, and they can trust other parts of us to pick up some of the slack where it's needed. In a bit, I'm going to lead you in a meditation to check in with your parts. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you, this is a story that I love. Henri Nouwen shares in his book, Life of the Beloved. And he shares of a prayer service that he led routinely for a small group of people. And some, but not all of the participants of this service had disabilities, mostly in their brain development. And right before the service began, a young woman with a cognitive disability named Janet said to Henri, "Can you give me a blessing?" And Nouwen, being Catholic, responded in an automatic way by quickly making a sign of the cross on her forehead and saying something about Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But rather than being grateful for his action, Janet was bothered. "No, that doesn't work. I want a real blessing," she says. And so Nouwen tells her that he'll give her a blessing at the end of the service. And so toward the end of the service, with about 30 people sitting around, Henri Nouwen explains that Janet has asked for a special blessing, and not really being sure what was expected of him, he stood up. And as soon as he did, Janet stood and quickly moved towards him. And he was wearing a white robe with big, flowy sleeves that extended past his hands. And as soon as Janet reached him, she embraced him, put her head against his chest. Henri put his arms around her so that she disappeared in the folds of his vestments, completely wrapped. And from the most real place in his heart, here's what he said to Janet. He said, "Janet, I want you to know that you're God's beloved daughter. You're precious in God's eyes. You're a beautiful human being. And you're deeply loved." And it didn't stop with Janet. After Janet, another disabled woman asked for a blessing. And then one of the assistants, a 24-year-old student, asked for one. And so it went. Each person being embraced, enveloped in white, and told the truth that they're beloved, deeply loved human beings, personally seen, not once or once in a while, but always, in every moment. And I want you to know that you're beloved. Yeah, you're greatly loved, and I'm so thankful for your courage in joining me here today. Now I'm going to lead us in a closing meditation to help you experience some of what I've shared, and just curious to see how that goes for you. Before I do that, here is my one promo. Parts of me, speaking of parts, really don't like this, but parts of me know that I have exciting things to offer, and the healing begins in a container. And so at the end of this month, on the 28th, I'm offering a 6-part coaching series where we'll use a lot of these principles from internal family systems. And we will meet for 6 consecutive weeks. If you're curious about that, you can find more at faithfullygrowing.com/inside. faithfullygrowing.com. I'm going to put it in the chat. Inside, and you can get more information about this group and register. There's an early bird rate until Monday of $225, and then that'll go up to $300. But would love to have you join me for that, where we can practice some of this in community together if you're interested. And feel free to send me an email, tim@faithfullygrowing.com, should you have questions. Let's go into our meditation for just a bit and just pause and settle in for a bit. I don't know if you're like me, but I know I was rushing back here from doctor's appointments with kids to make sure I made it back in time, and then had a little bit of technology trouble. See if you could land and just breathe with me for just a bit. You can close your eyes if you'd like to. If that's uncomfortable, know that you can just let your gaze rest softly in front of you. Just take a couple deep cleansing breaths. Just begin tuning into your internal world. What's coming up for you? Maybe you have a gathering over the weekend, or maybe there's a conversation that you've had previously that is still, there are parts coming up that are troubled. Just notice what's coming up. Parts of me that really want to get this right. Part that really wants to make sure that I'm communicating clearly. Just check in with your internal world. Sometimes it's helpful for me to imagine my parts joining me in a classroom or joining me around the table. Some may be eager to come in, and you're right here where I am. Some may be more distrustful and want to stay at the distance. Just notice and acknowledge those parts that are coming up. Thank them for their courage in showing up. Let them know there's no agenda. You're just glad that they're here. See if there are any other parts that may need to be seen or have a voice. Then check in and see if there's one part that you may be noticing the most. Maybe if you're imagining your parts in a classroom, have them raise their hand. See who would like a little attention right now. And see what you notice. See if there's one that maybe is up more than the others. Check in with your other parts that may not have been up the most, but they still have a voice, and see if they'd be willing to soften back and let you get to know this part that you're noticing the most right now. They can have a chance too, but If they can let you get to know this part that's up the most, you can all learn. And it can help that whole internal relationship. So just see if they would soften back just a bit. Check in with your other system, those parts that aren't up the most, but see if there are any fears or concerns for getting to know this part that you're noticing the most. And let those parts know that you see them. And that those fears and concerns are valid. We're not going to go anywhere they don't want to go. Just see if they could ease back just a bit, knowing that they can chime in at any time. But let them know that you see them, that you see their fears and concerns. And if they're able to soften back, and if they're not, maybe you need to turn your focus to one of those parts that just need that attention right now, and that's okay. But see if you can turn your attention, refocus to the part that you're noticing the most right now. How do you feel toward it? Is there some of those C's, calmness, curiosity, compassion? Is there a sense of presence, just wanting to be, or playfulness? See if you can tap in just to a drop, if that's it, of that self energy. And know that if there are parts coming up that want to push it away, don't want to go there, their resistance, those are likely parts. See if they could soften back to the crowd, knowing that they can have a chance to have some time with you too, that you'd like that if they'd like that. But focus back on that part that you're noticing the most. See if you can extend it just an ounce of curiosity, compassion. See if there's anything that it wants to share with you. Maybe it's been waiting a long time to get your attention. Let it know that you're here. See what it wants to share. What does it need? What do you want to share with the part that you're noticing the most right now? What questions do you have? What questions does that part have for you? Does it know who you are at your core? Sometimes it's helpful to check in with that little part. How old is it? How old does it think it is? there anything else that you need to share or that part would like to share with you? So as we begin to wrap up, spend just a little more time just noticing if there's anything else. And if you need more time than I'm allowing here, know that you can go back and watch the recording of this and share it with others if it's helpful, but you can take more time if you need it there. Just stay with your internal world for just a moment. Think the part that you've noticed the most during this meditation for its courage, for as much or as little that it shared. Check in and see if it's like having this time with you. And if it has and it feels right, let that part know it doesn't have to be the last time, that you'd like to spend more time with it if it would like that. And expand your attention out to those other parts that weren't up the most, but maybe it was those critics or those parts that just really wanted to get it right or to understand. Thank them for their courage and to just coming forward, being known a little more today. And let them know that if they like this time with you, that you can spend some more time with them if they'd like that. Just sit with your internal world for just a bit more. When it feels right for now, you can bring your awareness back to the present moment where you are. Just take a couple deep cleansing breaths again. You can open your eyes if they were closed. Move around a bit. And do what you need to do to come back to the present moment. And hopefully you can bring some of this compassion, this curiosity, this self-energy back into your daily life. I know it's challenging, but being aware of those parts, as hard as it is, and aware of that multiplicity, there's great opportunity for healing and for change. Thank you all. Thank you, Clouds, for joining in. And if you all have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll hang around for a bit more. Additionally, you can find more about me and my coaching practice and get some meditations like the one that I shared here, faithfullygrowing.com, if you click on blog. And then the end of the month, if you'd like to practice this parts work and systems work together, I'm offering a 6-week coaching series that begins on the 28th, I believe, and then it'll run for 6 consecutive weeks. It is at this time for 6 consecutive Fridays. You can find more about that by visiting faithfullygrowing.com. Type in the chat /insight. And I spelled that wrong. AITHFULLY /insight. There it is. If you would like that, or if you have questions, feel free to send me an email. If you're watching a recording of this, you can also send me an email to tim@faithfullygrowing.com. But I am having until Monday, that 6-week series is going to be $225, and then it'll go up to $300. Would love to have you join me if you can, but thank you again for your engagement. And look forward to crossing paths as it makes sense in the future. But thanks again for your courage in joining me for this webinar, and take good care of yourself.